In the times of Edward I and his predecessors, there was a deep hostility to Jews as religious anathema, who had rejected Jesus, who stubbornly continued to practice their religion. They became a resented minority, useful for certain purposes, largely financial, but mostly despised, ill-treated, and when their utility ran out, eventually expelled. That medieval suffering is met with modern indifference, in the application of an unambiguous double standard.
Well, look, good evening, everybody. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Centre for Independent Studies and to our 22nd Acton Lecture. Well, the Civil Society program, the Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society program at the CIS reflects upon questions of culture and society and civil society in contemporary Australia, including topics such as religious liberty, freedom of speech, multiculturalism, and the philosophical foundations of classical liberalism. We've also been doing work in antisemitism, particularly left-wing antisemitism, and some of that work goes back to my early days at the CIS in 2012. But we cover a range of issues. Last year, for example, the Chief Justice of New South Wales delivered a lecture for us here about the decay of truth and its implications for the administration of justice. The issue with which this year's Acton Lecture will engage is antisemitism, the hatred of Jews. It's a form of hatred from which Australia has never been entirely free, but which has confronted us in a particularly virulent form since October 2023. The tropes of antisemitism are age-old, and they precede Israel's founding. They precede its conflict with the Palestinians and its dealings with its Arab neighbors. And yet antisemitism mutates and takes on different forms, and it is this persistence of antisemitism with which tonight's Acton Lecture is concerned. And so to our lecturer himself. Rabbi Elton has been Chief Minister of the Great Synagogue since 2015. He was born in England, read history at the University of Cambridge, followed by a PhD in Jewish history at the University of London. He worked for a number of years at the Ministry of Justice in London before studying for the rabbinate in New York. He is married to Hinda Young, who I'm delighted joins us this evening, and they are the proud parents of 3 lively children. I'm delighted that Rabbi Elton has accepted the invitation to deliver the Centre for Independent Studies Acton Lecture, and I invite you to welcome him now.
Good evening. I want to thank the Centre for Independent Studies and Peter Curti for inviting me to give the 2025 Acton Lecture and to speak on antisemitism. It is very sad indeed that this is such a pressing topic in contemporary Australia, but I feel your solidarity in your presence here this evening, and I also particularly acknowledge Gillian Siegel and applaud the work that she's been doing. The task that she faces, which we all face, is certainly a great one. There's been at least a 4-fold increase in anti-Semitic incidents in Australia in the past 18 months, with synagogues, schools, daycares, homes and cars all being vandalised, even torched, students intimidated, members of the Jewish community doxed. Australia's future as a peaceful and harmonious society depends on how we respond to this crisis, and that we must include all Australians, which is why it is so encouraging that this lecture takes place under the auspices of an institution concerned with the whole of Australian civil culture and not just within the Jewish community. The lecture is named for Lord Acton, who is best known for his saying, which is quite accurate, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." As we look into the history of anti-Semitism and try to work out how we deal with it today, we can be well guided by some other words of Lord Acton when he said, "The science of politics is the one science that is deposited by the streams of history, like the grains of gold in the sand of a river, and the knowledge of the past, the record of truths revealed by experience, is eminently practical. It's an instrument of action and a power that goes to making the future. I am a historian, as well as a rabbi, and I intend to look at this question, as Lord Acton recommends, through a historical lens, turning only to current events once I've built up the historical bedrock on which we stand. And I want to begin with a personal anecdote. In July 2022, I took my family to England, where my parents and my brother and his family still live, and we visited the Tower of London. We saw the ravens and the crown jewels, and I also noticed an admirably frank informational sign which stated, quote, "King Edward I built St. Thomas's Tower as a grand river entrance and luxurious royal apartments in the late 1270s. The building work was partly funded by a heavy tax that Edward imposed on England's Jewish community." Those certainly were heavy taxes. Between 1219 and 1272, the English crown imposed 49 levies specifically on Jews, for a total of £300,000 in 13th century money. To give a modern equivalent, that's about £500 million from a Jewish population of no more than 5,000. You will recall that by 2022, there was already an active movement to identify historic beneficiaries of the transatlantic slave trade, to expose them and to hold them to account, for example, by encouraging those who had benefited to make financial contributions to addressing the legacy of slavery. That led, for example, to the Church of England allocating £1 billion for that purpose. There'd also been a spate of statue toppling, tearing down images of men who've been active in the slave trade. I'm not convinced about the payment of money today or of the vigilante destruction of public property, but I am in favour of historical inquiry and transparency. And in that spirit, I wrote to The Guardian with a proposal for an article, an audit into the medieval English institutions still functioning today that benefited from money extorted from Jews in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Crown, of course, but also churches and cathedrals, Oxford and Cambridge colleges. My college was founded in 1448, so we're in the clear. The City of London, and so forth. This was not in the spirit of whataboutery, but in order to broaden our awareness of historic wrongs, which still bring material benefit today. The Guardian did not respond to my proposal. And I heard in that silence a meeting of medieval and modern attitudes towards Jews. In the times of Edward I and his predecessors, there was a deep hostility to Jews as religious anathema, who had rejected Jesus, who stubbornly continued to practice their religion. They became a resented minority, useful for certain purposes, largely financial, but mostly despised, ill-treated, and when their utility ran out, eventually expelled. That medieval suffering is met with modern indifference in the application of an unambiguous double standard. The enterprise dedicated to excavating the legacy of African slavery in the United States is called the 1619 Project, because that is the year the first enslaved Africans arrived in the colony of Virginia. It grew out of a New York Times initiative, but now describes a much wider cultural and intellectual tendency. Many influential voices in academia and culture believe it is entirely appropriate to review events that happened over 400 years ago from a moral point of view. And yet, while events 4 centuries ago are seen as relevant to this activity, for some reason, events 7.5 centuries ago are not. I cannot see the difference in principle between these two cases, enslaved Africans and exploited and expelled Jews. In both cases, we know something about the people affected at the time, and we know who their cultural and communal descendants are today. But the travails of one group from one period is considered a legitimate area of work, while the other is not. And the group that is not is the Jews. And of course, the issue is not really one of the passage of time. In the late 1980s, the Conservative government in Britain tried to pass a War Crimes Act to prosecute Nazi war criminals living in Britain. When those debates were taking place in 1988, 1989, People of the age I am today had lived through the Holocaust, yet it was considered by a majority of members of the House of Lords to be too long ago. By any rational assessment, this does not seem tenable. So the phenomenon I am exposing cannot be explained by merely counting the years. Here's another example of a historic wrong against the Jews that is both unrighted and no one seems interested in righting. The Lutheran Church is named after Martin Luther. He was a great theologian. He was possibly the most influential figure of the 16th century. But he also said this, quote, "Be on your guard against the Jews, knowing that wherever they have their synagogues is found but a den of devils, in which sheer self-glory, conceit, lies, blasphemy, and defaming of God and men are practiced most maliciously." Luther also argued and urged violence against Jews, and was greatly influential in encouraging those acts to be carried out in Germany and elsewhere during his lifetime and after his death, including in the Holocaust. And yet 77 million Christians today accept the name of Lutheran and thereby honor the name of Martin Luther. And that seems not just anomalous, but disturbing and calls out for explanation. If we turn from religion to culture, we find a similar selective myopia. I saw recently that Danny Scott, a reporter for Metro Entertainment, argued that, quote, "Signing on to the new HBO series, or any other Harry Potter project for that matter, is an endorsement of its creator, J.K. Rowling, and what I consider to be her bigoted and transphobic views." Scott declared, quote, "I won't forgive any actor who joins the Harry Potter TV series. This is a clear call for cancelling actors who will play a role in a television series based on books written by a person they regard as transphobic." But let's take another case. Roald Dahl was a very popular author, especially for children. I read him when I was a kid. He was also a well-known antisemite who told the New Statesman in 1983, quote, "There is a trait in the Jewish character that does provoke animosity. Even a stinker like Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason." And nevertheless, adaptations of Dahl's works continue to pour out, and The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar, released in 2023 with a star-studded cast, even has Ralph Fiennes playing Dahl himself. The unapologetic, explicit, anti-Semitic author is himself portrayed without any comment at all. Indeed, the film has a 97% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. We cannot miss the double standard. We can examine a comparison closer to home. At public events, including at my synagogue, we are reminded that we're meeting on Gadigal land, and I support that practice. We often hear the phrase, "This is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded," and I have sympathy with that point of view. When Europeans arrived here in the late 18th century, there may have been as many as 4,000 Gadigal people in the area around Port Jackson. The epidemic of smallpox in 1789 killed all but 3. There may be around 100 Gadigal descendants on their original country today. The city of Sydney alone has over 200,000 residents, and Greater Sydney has over 5 million. Yet I acknowledge the Gadigal as the Indigenous people of this area, and so does the political and cultural convention. The displacement and near total genocide of the Gadigal people and many other Indigenous peoples over 200 years ago is not relevant. They were here, they survived, and they are still here, and we should respect that. We can compare that to the attitude of many loud voices in our society, especially in its academic institutions, towards the place of the Jews in the land of Israel, roughly the area which constitutes the State of Israel, plus the West Bank and some other areas. There can be no reasonable doubt that the Jews are descended from the people who lived in that area until they were expelled by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and when they reconstituted their polity, again by the Romans, in 70 CE. These Jews and their descendants have always been aware of their exile from the land of Israel, they've always prayed in the direction of Jerusalem and look forward to their return there. As the medieval Hebrew poet Yehuda Halevi wrote, "My heart is in the east, and I am in the depths of the west." Wherever a Jew may be, they are hoping to return to Jerusalem. And not all Jews left, even under the Romans. At least a small remnant of Jews remained in the land of Israel. Over the centuries, the Jewish population fluctuated as new communities were founded and then collapsed under the weight of persecution. Nevertheless, Jews from around the world never stopped trying to live in the land of Israel. In pre-modern times, this had a religious motivation. But even after many Jews became secular, the Zionist movement picked up the mantle and expressed the national desire of non-religious Jews to return to their homeland. When Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, refers to Hatikva Shnot Alpayim, the hope of 2,000 years, it is making a historical claim, and it is a fair one. Yet some deny this Jewish indigeneity in the land of Israel and the Jewish connection to the land, sometimes in dangerous ways. Last December, when the Pope inaugurated a series of nativity scenes in the Vatican, one depicted the baby Jesus lying on a keffiyeh, the scarf used by many Palestinians as a national symbol. And the claim is clear. Jesus either was Palestinian, or today's Palestinians embody the spirit of Jesus. This erases Jesus' Jewishness and the ancient presence in the land of Israel, and it also reinstates the charge of deicide. It presents ancient Jews and contemporary Israelis as enemies of God. And this is extraordinarily irresponsible. It is no wonder that the Vatican swiftly removed the scene, but it is remarkable that it was ever allowed to be installed in the first place. In the wake of 2 millennia of Christian antisemitism, it is extraordinary, bordering on the incomprehensible, that Vatican officials did not see the implication of this Palestinian Jesus. Perhaps to some extent, they endorsed it. Among those who take a secular perspective, I've heard the objection that the Jewish people cannot use an Iron Age myth that God promised them a land to their ancestors to claim a right to that land today. But if those critics don't accept the Bible's account, then they are left with the academic consensus. The Israelites were an indigenous Canaanite tribe that came to dominate their small region, and only subsequently created a mythic account of their origin. Either way, their descendants have a right to a presence and self-rule in the land. Zionism, or the State of Israel, cannot be a settler colonial enterprise, because an indigenous people cannot be settler colonialists. At the same time, we can fully accept, as I do, that other people came to live in the land of Israel after 70 CE. They too should be considered indigenous at this point, but the conflict cannot be fairly understood as between an indigenous people and a settler people, but two indigenous peoples, and they each have to be accommodated. To paint it in any other terms is to apply a double standard. Whether the dispossession took place 200 years ago, in the case of First Nation Australians, or 2,000 years ago in the case of the Jews, it makes no moral difference. And no one who gives a welcome to or an acknowledgement of country can reasonably oppose the Zionist enterprise in principle. And if they do, we have to ask why there is a double standard, which we've now seen expressed in several different forms and contexts. But where does this double standard originate? I suggest it is on deep foundations of anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish ideas and sentiments. In a 2023 lecture in Sydney, the scholar of antisemitism Dr. Dave Rich shared a fascinating piece of research. In the late 1340s, Jews in German lands were blamed for spreading the Black Death by poisoning wells. Rich told us that Jews were then arrested, expelled, or burnt to death. The images of Jews as poisoners, either literally or metaphorically, and as a threat to the health of the nation became fixed. 600 years later, anti-Semitic violence and support for the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s was higher in towns and cities which had seen anti-Jewish violence and repression during the Black Death. This subterranean anti-Semitism may be invisible, but it is powerfully present, and it is what is leading to the double standard in the West today. I want to take as a case study Rory Stewart, not because he's the most significant or distressing example of this trend, but because his example sheds light on the issue we are discussing. He's a former British diplomat and politician, a conservative with both a large and small c, a Christian, and now a very popular commentator on public affairs. He also has a Jewish grandfather, a Jewish wife, and Jewish friends, including the liberal and secular Israeli intellectual Yuval Noah Harari. I am sure he would be horrified, affronted, indignant to be called an antisemite, and I don't think he is one in a conventional sense. But there is something going on. I was a regular listener to his podcast with Alistair Campbell, The Rest is Politics, but I found myself unable to listen after October the 7th, 2023. I recently went back for the purposes of this lecture to listen again to his early comments after the Hamas attack. On October 12th, with all of his foreign office and military background, he explained how the way Hamas were embedded in Gaza would make it very difficult for Israel to conduct military operations without significant civilian casualties. As many did, he compared the situation to the battle for Mosul in 2016 to 2017, when anti-ISIS forces attempted to retake the city and largely destroyed it in the endeavour, killing around 10,000 civilians. During the Mosul campaign, Stewart was a minister in the British government, and he spoke out in support of this anti-ISIS offensive. We might expect, on this basis, that Stewart would have a circumspect response to the war in Gaza as it got underway. And yet as early as 20th of October, less than 2 weeks after the Hamas atrocity, Stewart was comparing the 1,300 killed in Israel and the 200 taken hostage with Hamas figures of 2,750 dead in Gaza and 9,700 injured, creating a sort of moral equivalence. Empathy for Israel, and even the appreciation of the difficulties and complexities Israel faced seemed to be draining away less than a fortnight after Hamas began the conflict. When Stewart actually saw Jews acting on a collective level to respond to an attack made upon them, he was repulsed by it. By February the 15th this year, with Hamas still holding dozens of Israeli hostages, alive or dead, but with a ceasefire already in place, Stewart was calling Israel's actions, quote, outrageous, unforgivable, ethnic cleansing, completely illegal. He endorsed prosecution of Israeli leaders in international courts, and in an ironic phrase, he called the response of the West, quote, double standards. Stewart went on to say, quote, this is not the democratic Israel that people like Noah Yuval Harari stood up for. This was never supposed to be the vision of liberal Jews. We now see clearly the sort of Jews or Israelis that Stewart approves of. People like his friend Harari, liberal, secular Jews. As I've mentioned, Stewart himself is religious and a conservative, but in his view, Jews ought to be secular and liberal, who will not be too assertive, even in the wake of an event like October the 7th. And what caused this outpouring of outrage on February the 15th? It was Donald Trump's idea to remove the Palestinian population of Gaza. But that is not a proposal that the government of Israel has endorsed, which raises the question, why was Stewart railing against Israel? If we look further into Stewart's comments about Jews, we find that when Jeremy Corbyn was removed from the Labour Party for his attitude to anti-Semitism, he declared, I think it's disgusting that he was thrown out of the Labour Party. This was despite the fact that Stewart admitted that, quote, there was horrifying anti-Semitism in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Nevertheless, for Stewart, it was more important that, quote, parties with serving MPs in Parliament should have broad coalitions, that a man who allowed anti-Semitism to flourish should be removed. I was increasingly puzzled and disappointed by Stewart's approach until I saw his bad-tempered exchange on X with Vice President DJ Vance. The Vice President had argued it was, quote, a very Christian concept to, quote, love your family and then love your neighbour and then love your community and then love your fellow citizens in your own country, And then after that, you can focus on and prioritize the rest of the world. Stuart responded as a Christian, and there followed an increasingly rude set of comments back and forward, which arrived at Stuart making this statement, quote, "Jesus' love is universal. This is what made Christianity so radical among tribal religions. When asked who is my neighbor, Jesus chose a Samaritan, an outsider and theological enemy of the Jews, as the moral exemplar, to challenge the idea that obligation is primarily to one's own people or community." Well, first of all, Stuart is wrong on the facts. It is the Hebrew Bible that tells us 36 times to love the stranger. But my most fundamental question is, who are these tribal religions to which Christianity is morally superior? I assume he's not referring to indigenous peoples who encountered Christianity when colonizers and missionaries arrived. Is Stuart really saying they were improved by the white man bringing the gospel? I suggest not. I think by tribal he means Jews and Judaism. He means me and my religion. And this is classic, unreconstructed Christian anti-Judaism. In his view, fostered by his culture, we Jews follow a primitive, angry, and violent God. Jesus showed us a different way, but we have refused to take it. And as Christopher Hitchens said, for that the Jews will never be forgiven. And now Stuart's other positions make sense. Western countries, Arab countries can wage war, even with high civilian casualties, and that is the way of the world. But when Jews do it, it is awful and outrageous, and the international courts should intervene. Jews should be secular and liberal, and dare I say it, turn the other cheek. Antisemitism is not a nice thing, but there are deemed to be more important matters to worry about, and Jews should just put up with it. Jews certainly may not respond on a collective level, like other people can, because Jews apparently have no right to a collective identity. Stuart and others complain about double standards. In fact, theirs is a double standard, because they will not judge Jews on the same basis they judge other national groups. And Stuart is just an example and not alone in these attitudes. I think he merely surfaced, unknowingly, a feeling that flows like a stream beneath Western society. And I think it explains a lot about what has gone on in the West and amongst Westerners since October the 7th. The way that tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets to condemn Israel just a few days after the attack, when Israel had endured such a brutal assault and before it had taken any substantial action in response. The way there has been no similar demonstration about events in Syria, Sudan, Yemen, or China. The way there were definitely no widespread demonstrations led by non-Jews demanding the release of the hostages. Indeed, the Gaza protests call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, abandoning innocent men, women, and tiny children. The way we saw Holocaust denial in real time, as Westerners parroted Hamas propaganda that there hadn't been targeting of civilians on October the 7th, even though Hamas themselves recorded and broadcast the evidence for those crimes. The moral inconsistency did not come from nowhere, but is steeped in the anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic history and culture of the West. We've seen the same in the domestic Australian response to anti-Semitism. In the past couple of weeks, parts of the media have attempted to downplay the presence of anti-Semitism on Australian streets. When the police revealed the Dural caravan bomb could not have exploded, and so was in some ways a hoax, and those arrested had themselves not shown anti-Semitic tendencies, some outlets jumped to assert the spate of incidents over the summer were not themselves anti-Semitic. That is so absurd, it amounts to gaslighting the Jewish community, who are being told that anti-Semitic graffiti on schools and childcare centres, in Jewish neighbourhoods, on Jewish businesses and synagogues, all being targeted because they are Jewish, is somehow not anti-Semitic. We have civic leaders who cannot allow a reference to anti-Semitism to stand alone and insist on coupling it with Islamophobia. Both are repugnant, but by any empirical measure, there is no doubt what is the crisis at the moment. It is synagogues that have been burned down and Jewish facilities defaced. We've seen it in the way that Jews or Israel are blamed for antisemitism. For example, the student group at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music projected this on a slide at its Orientation Week event. Quote, "There is also rising antisemitism around Australia and the world because of Israel's conflation of Judaism with their actions in the Levant." There are two interesting points about that sentence. First of all, antisemitism is hyphenated, which is not correct practice. And two, no one's used the word Levant since about 1878. But I've never heard or seen the Israeli government saying our policy represents Judaism. It is antisemites who do that. It is the way that not Jews but antisemites weaponize antisemitism to deter examination of their statements for racism by claiming that any critique is an attempt to silence criticisms of the government of Israel, when all the leading Jewish bodies state repeatedly that criticisms of the policy of the Israeli government are entirely legitimate. It's the way that an anti-racist conference of all places, we found the organizers appointed a Jewish speaker to attack other Jews and the Jewish community in the nastiest terms, using anti-Semitic tropes as the audience laughed, applauded, and approved. No problem, not anti-Semitism, not anything else, can be solved until its deep causes are understood. And it's those deep causes I've tried to uncover this evening. The resilience of anti-Semitism in our society will remain puzzling unless we go to its roots. The cases I have mentioned both before and after October the 7th take different forms, but are composed of the same matter. I believe it is the anti-Semitic attitudes, prejudices and racism that are baked into the Western inheritance. Many of us are advocates of much of what the West has brought to the world, but the portion of its foundations that are anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic have to be removed and replaced. The deepest, most thoughtful, and most honest work will be necessary to achieve that, but nothing will change in the long term until we do. Thank you.
Ben, thank you very much indeed for that very lucid and searching address. Just something that occurs to me at the outset, you talked about early on in your lecture about the different standards applied to descendants of the slave trade. And it made me think of a remark that the late Jonathan Sacks made about anti-Semitism, which he said exists where there are two contradictory factors appearing in combination. On the one hand, Jews are so powerful that they're responsible for all the evils of the world, and the knowledge that they are so powerless that they can be intact with impunity. And I wonder whether the difference between slavery and the anti-Semitism that you're identifying is that slaves are seen as wholly powerless. And I wonder to what extent you can account for the persistence of anti-Semitism given that contradiction. Jews are either powerful or they're powerless, but they can't be both, and yet they are deemed to be both. How do you account for that?
The contradictions and the paradoxes in anti-Semitism are well remarked upon. Jews are both communists undermining society and bloodsucking capitalists exploiting non-Jewish workers, members of the proletariat. In fact, I think there are two different strains of anti-Semitism. There is what you might call xenophobic anti-Semitism, which is that usually targeted at Jews who are largely powerless, but are poor, are a drain on resources, are unsanitary, are a stain on society, a blemish on society. And that is not necessarily the most prominent form now. The most prominent form now is Jews as powerful. An international Jewish conspiracy, Jews controlling the media, Jews controlling the banks and international institutions. So Rabbi Sacks identified two aspects, but I don't think they are the same anti-Semitism in a strange combination. There's actually two. And once we understand which is in play at a particular point, it can be more easily dealt with, understood.
And do you think that shift to, as it were, the powerful form of anti-Semitism, if I may put it in that way, has also been fueled by the political left? which has taken very much the line that, you picked up on these themes of settler colonialism, that the anti-Zionism that marks a lot of the political left, that the existence of the state of Israel and the presence of Jews in Western society is actually a threat to the international order. Do you think that shift is? How do you think that prevalence came about? That's the question I want to ask. How has that evolution taken place?
I think it does come from a left-wing analysis, or an analysis that comes from part of the left, which has divided the world into the oppressed and oppressors. And white people are oppressors and non-white people are oppressed. And first of all, that's a flawed way of looking at the world. But also, in a second flaw, Jews are identified as white, with all that brings with it, which is not the case. But in this far left analysis, Jews just fall into the wrong category, and therefore they are condemned as a group.
And the problem with that analysis that you identified is that, in fact, when there are victims and oppressors, there's always somebody to hate, and that whoever is the object of hate will receive and have that hatred directed at them in uncompromising ways. At the moment, we're seeing that directed, I think, towards the state of Israel, towards its government, towards Jews. And I'm not saying that criticism of the Israeli government is unfair. I think it is fair, but that conflation, I think, it seems to me, has come about because this powerful paradigm of victim and oppressor, of innocent and perpetrator, has really taken hold. How is that changing, do you think? Do you see any signs of that lessening?
No, I think it's increasing. But I think it's the state of the discourse. I think it's very easy to tell the difference between honest, fair criticism, even of the harshest sort, and hatred. And I think, for the most part, Jews have been very fair in pushing back against criticism, but only calling out hatred for what it is. But I think that distinction is actually dismissed, not by, as I said in my lecture, not by Zionists or Jews, but is dismissed by people who want to show hatred of Jews, incubated by placing themselves within the anti-Israel movement. So that is to say, if you have a movement, the anti-Israel movement, which identifies the state of Israel as inherently wicked, inherently an oppressor, and because most Jews are Zionists and most Zionists are Jews, if you're somebody who hates Jews, it's a very good place to put yourself, because you can attack those people with absolute impunity and actually regard yourself as morally superior and receive the endorsement of many people for your actions and your statements. That doesn't mean that being anti-Israel or even anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic in all cases. But if you are anti-Semitic, it's a very good place to put yourself, and the discourse and the culture around the discourse at the moment supports it and endorses it.
But it's quite legitimate to criticize the actions of the government of Israel.
Yes, and Jews do, and non-Jews do, and that's quite right. It's a democratic government of one of the states that make up the United Nations. It's absolutely open to criticism, like Australia or America or England, anywhere else. And as I say, all the leading bodies make that point repeatedly and clearly, and it's simply a calumny to say Jews try to, or Zionists try to repress all criticism of Israel by calling it anti-Semitic. It just isn't true.
One of the responses, and again, just to pick up one of the topics that you touched on, that many political leaders make, I think particularly on the left, is to denounce all forms of racism. That's how Jeremy Corbyn at first defended criticisms of his action and inaction in the British Labour Party, to say they condemn all forms of racism. And as you mentioned, that there is often this conflation of Islamophobia and antisemitism. Islamophobia is a complex term, which dates back to as early as the 1904, in fact, I think, or even later, earlier than that, in the late years of the 19th century. But it became current in the 1990s when the Runnymede Trust started using it. Do you think that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are terms which, notwithstanding the issue of racism, are terms that can bear or do bear the same moral weight? Because isn't one form of discrimination, whether it's against Muslims or against Jews, isn't one form of discrimination as bad as another?
Yes, yeah, I do believe that. I believe that Islamophobia is just as bad as antisemitism. The question, though, remains, what is the crisis of the hour? And are you bringing in another form of hatred in order to diminish or distract from the one that's really at stake? The comparison I bring is Black Lives Matter. Some people wanted to say, no, we shouldn't say Black Lives Matter, we say all lives matter. And I rejected that at the time as being morally reprehensible, because it is black people being the victims of brutality, murder, that is the crisis. And saying all lives matter is obviously true, but it is both in effect and I think in intention an attempt to distract from the suffering of a particular group who are suffering particularly.
There were black commentators in the US who said all lives matter, and they were denounced for it. So black people themselves were denounced for affirming the very principle that you object to.
And there are Jews such as Sarah Schwartz who, as I said, launched that terrible attack in Brisbane. That doesn't determine the rights and wrongs of it.
How do we counter racism then, if we're looking whether it's racism against Jews or against blacks? Is racism something that we can have one form of strategy to deal with, or do different forms of racism require different approaches, different political approaches?
I think it depends on the level of detail you're dealing with. So there should be, in the absence of a reference to particular events or crises, at the level of high policy and aims and objectives, an opposition to all forms of racism. That's perfectly legitimate. When you get down into details of what's happening on our streets today, then you have to target whatever is the crisis of the moment. And each form of racism has a different history, a different set of causes, and different set of expressions. And each deserve the dignity of being examined in their own right and dealt with in the ways that analysis reveals is going to be most effective. Islamophobia, anti-black racism has a different history, a different expression to antisemitism. And so you can't just apply the same methods to each type. They should all be tackled.
We come to the question of the thorny question of religion,
which we know nothing.
About which we know nothing. Christian antisemitism, Christian and Judophobia has been a recurring and long-standing problem, as you've correctly identified. And yet, how hopeful are you that the Christian churches are making, perhaps to say, are making amends? I think if groups like the Council of Christians and Jews, you have been involved with that. In fact, you had to come and speak at a meeting in Sydney a number of years ago, and in many parts of Europe, councils of Christians and Jews meet, I think, in a real spirit of reconciliation and a search for understanding. Is this just a form of tokenism, do you think, or are these sorts of approaches really valuable?
I think they are valuable, but they're also limited in their effectiveness. So many Jews who are connected with, deeply involved in interfaith work, in my case for 8 years before October the 7th, sort of looked round, and the people we've been dialoguing with, for example, from different churches, were just nowhere to be seen after October the 7th. They were not saying what needed to be said. And a charitable, I think maybe even a fair reading of that is they just didn't know what to say. They didn't know who they were going to offend. They didn't know how to phrase it properly, so they said nothing. But many of us felt, I put in 8 years, there are people in this community, the Jewish community in Sydney, who put their entire adult life into dialogue with Christians, for example, and they turned round and there was nothing. And therefore there's had to be a lot of rebuilding of those relationships, and also some truth-telling. So there was a subsequent meeting, it took place in the Great Synagogue with senior figures from a particular denomination, and we laid it on the line. And whereas previous meetings had been very polite and reserved, and you're marvelous and we're marvelous, it was actually the most real conversation, right? Because we said, you let us down, we feel you let us down in these ways, and you need to know that.
And how did they respond to that?
they responded, with humility and with grace, but it's still a long process to actually help them understand why that happened and how it happened. Because I think because the deeply baked attitudes, remain there even while these conversations on the surface are taking place.
I think that's true, and I think that that many Christians still have a very a naive understanding of the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, between Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures, as if somehow Christian scriptures have displaced and rendered redundant. It's a very hard attitudes to overcome, and I think also one of the things that irks me, if I may say so, is that the people often refer to the violent image of the God of the Hebrew scriptures as if that is somehow normative today. These are not normative. The descriptions of God and accounts of God's action and behavior are not normative, and yet many Christians, I think, do regard them as if they are still normative, and on that basis to be rejected.
I think they're an anti-Semitic reading. I think if you want to read Jews in a particular way, you read the God as he appears in the Hebrew Bible in a particular way, but it's not a fair reading either of the text itself if it's read carefully and thoughtfully, but it's definitely not a fair reading of the rabbinic reading of the text, which is very ancient and very thorough and very considered. So it becomes a vicious cycle. In the distant past, anti-Semites read the Hebrew Bible in a particular way to paint Jews badly. That became an established reading, and now continues to exist, even though people who are reading it in that way are not consciously anti-Semitic, but they have this anti-Semitic heritage, which they don't know what to do with, how to process, how to revise.
One more question from me, and then we'll go to the audience, about far-right anti-Semitism, because in many respects, far-right anti-Semitism has been discredited in most liberal democratic states. And so with the election of right-wing governments or right-wing parties or far-right parties in Europe, this has caused a great deal of concern about fears of a return to Nazism and the era of the Third Reich. And in many countries, including Australia, displays of images associated with Nazism is now widely illegal. One of the things that interests me, though, about the form of populism that we're seeing now is this division between the people and the enemies of the people. The populists are for the people, and the enemies of the people are the ones that populists are going to denounce and defeat. To what extent do you think anti-Semitism will be or might be fueled by the rise of populist movements with a new enemy and populist governments, particularly in Europe?
And America, I would say as well.
America.
Yes, absolutely. Populist movements always look for the enemy within, and Jews have always provided a very useful example, creation applied to them of the enemy within. But there's now a growing trend in America of the right-wing Trumpian podcasts taking an anti-Jewish turn. So we see in this American Trumpian populism also the way it's allowing anti-Semitism into the door. And I think this is always a danger with populist movements, and Jews are always the victims of it.
Do you think commentators like Ben Shapiro, a young, very articulate Jewish conservative commentator, do you think the work that people like Ben Shapiro does is helpful?
It is on the right. Tucker Carlson suddenly came out with these extraordinary anti-Semitic views, and Ben Shapiro, who had been vaguely associated with him, led the attack. I think he's only effective against other people in his own area of the political spectrum. But I think he has to be deployed against his former colleagues who have turned in such a nasty way in the recent period.
Okay, thank you. Let's come to the audience now. As I said earlier, there is a roving microphone, and if you will just raise your hand, Richard.
Rabbi, that was a wonderful address that you gave, really excellent in explaining the way I understand the situation has developed the way in which it has for Jewish people and Israelis. The answer that you gave to Peter's question about the grouping of Christian and Jewish people in a council to discuss common views finished up being dismissed by you because of the way you were abandoned as Jews at the first sign of grape shot. It happened just like that. And then in the end of your comments, when you were speaking, you talked about 2,000 years of the development of an issue that is anti-Semitism today. And you also said it is going to take a long, long time because that needs to be overthrown before the problem will disappear. You put those two things together, and I was really hoping you were going to keep speaking so that you might say something about the solution.
I'll quote Rabbi Tarfon from the rabbinic teachings, who said, "It is not our duty to complete the task, but rather are we free to desist from it." It's can only be done by keeping working. And after October the 7th, many people stepped back from interfaith work, but now we're back in it. I think we needed time to retreat from it. We were so hurt, but I'm pleased to say that there's now been a re-engagement, and we have to continue the work. But also our interlocutors have to continue the work. Has to be an element of self-examination, and then we can meet.
Next question, Simon Haynes.
Thanks, Peter. Rabbi, thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Would you talk to us a little bit about what you might call the protocols of the Elders of Zion variant of anti-Semitism? The idea that Jews are behind the scenes pulling the levers in finance, in politics, even in the arts, which seems almost like the archetype of all conspiracy theories, really. Can you connect that at all with what you were saying about medieval anti-Semitism, or where else might you find the roots of that variant?
It comes down to the idea that Jews are diabolical in some sense, which is clearly a medieval thought, that Jews are in league with the devil and that the devil is powerful. The devil changes. Sometimes the devil is, a man with a pointy tail and a trident. Sometimes the devil is international finance or the media or the United Nations, whatever it happens to be. Jews are identified with powerful, shadowy, manipulative institutions, and human beings are naturally religious creatures, but the religion changes. And people may not believe very broadly now in a literal devil, but they just apply the same religious thinking to the idea of a cabal controlling the world, a sinister intelligence. And Jews have always been associated with that and still are today.
Richard Bronowski, former Australian diplomat, served some time in the Middle East. You Roald Dahl very well, our ambassador in Tel Aviv a few years ago. Rabbi, it was a very interesting talk, but I worry about the weaponization of anti-Semitism in Australia. Now, this talk was about the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia. Connecting the dots, it relates a lot to what Netanyahu and his government are doing in Gaza. It worries me very much that we have this difficulty in having separate the two things. What the Netanyahu government is doing in Gaza, which amounts almost to genocide, and anti-Semitism. Is there any reason why there should not be a rise of anti-Semitism in Australia as a result of what he is doing in Gaza? Thank you.
Is your question a moral one or a practical one? I would say this. Anti-Semitic graffiti, referring to Nazis on a childcare centre for small Jewish children, has got nothing to do with what's going on in Israel or Gaza. Burning down a synagogue in Melbourne, by the way, those people in that synagogue aren't even Zionists. It has nothing to do with what's going on in Gaza. If you want to protest, let them go to the Israeli embassy, let them go to the Israeli consulate, let them have their demonstrations in a non-intimidating ways. But why on earth should Jewish Australians, Australian Jews, who are not responsible for the policies of the State of Israel, who may not even endorse all of them, why should our homes, our businesses, our places of worship be the subject of violence, intimidation, damage, because of what's going on in Israel? Morally, it is reprehensible to make small children walk past vile graffiti because of a conflict thousands of miles away.
Rolf CIS, as a Christian leader, I want to thank you for your courageous denunciation of our serious, not my faith, but of the way many of my co-religionists have behaved, and I think that's very important. You were unrelenting in that criticism. I accept it. This is not whataboutism, and it's not that relevant to Australia, but it is sort of. Would you like to comment briefly upon Islamic antisemitism and its difference from, that's what I'll say, because it strikes me that's another issue that's out there as well in the world. Thank you.
First of all, I want to say in public, as I said in private, my thanks, because Rob Forsyth contacted me a while ago and said that me and my family and our congregation were in his prayers at his church, and that was immensely moving for me to hear, and I'm very grateful, and I'm sure they were heard on high. Yes, there's also Muslim antisemitism. There's also Muslim antisemitism, also supersessionist in its nature. They have their supersessionist story, like Christianity has its supersessionist story. I quoted Christopher Hitchens. Many Christians, some Christians, can't forgive the Jews for not waking up to what they were bringing. Many Muslims can't forgive the Jews for not waking up to what they were bringing. We have to move past supersessionism. And Christianity is making more progress on that than Islam at the moment. But ultimately, Muslim anti-Semitism will not be resolved until that supersessionist story is revised in some way.
Lorraine Finlay, Human Rights Commissioner. Thank you, Lorraine.
And so my name is Lorraine Finlay. I'm from the Human Rights Commission. And I was just interested in asking you, there's been a lot of criticisms, and some very justly, about the human rights community not responding in accordance with the principles of universal application of human rights, which should guide our actions, and in particular noting that October 7 happened in the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, which was built on those principles of universal application. And I'm thinking in particular of things like feminists who've spent years proclaiming, believe all women, and yet seem to be unable to translate that into action when it came to responding to October 7. So my question is whether you could make some comment about how we actually take human rights principles and apply them universally when the history of not just post-October 7, but indeed the United Nations in a much longer phase of time seems to have been unable to do that in practice when it comes to anti-Semitism and in particular the Jewish people.
I agree with you very much. There's a phrase, check your privilege. I think there also needs to be a phrase, check your double standard. And a certain humility and openness to when that double standard is pointing out, not to be very defensive and resistant, but actually to do the introspection and to reapply a fair standard to all people, Jews, non-Jews, Israelis, non-Israelis, which is currently lacking. And I think there also needs to be an academic revision, because I think a lot of the human rights community is operating under a certain academic paradigm, which is not a truthful one, a fair one, and it's very destructive, actually, to the fair assessment and improvement of human rights.
Thank you, Lorraine, for your question. Question in the back.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. There's still fewer Jews than before the Holocaust. And I've always been brought up to think that we have a special obligation to help ensure that never happens again. After October 7th, that very much seems to be lost, particularly probably amongst my age group, both a bit younger and a bit older than me as well. Why do you think that's happened, and how has that happened?
I think that the West is very happy to rid itself of its Holocaust guilt. That since 1945, Europe in particular, but other places as well in the same culture, have had to accept a collective guilt for perpetrating or allowing the Holocaust to happen. And they are desperate to shrug it off. And being able to say the Jews, the Israelis, are just as bad or they're worse is a very convenient way to do that, which is why you get all the Holocaust and Nazi associations. That's a reflection of what people are trying to do. We just don't make us feel guilty anymore. We don't have to, because they're even worse than we were.
We have a question on the side here.
Going back to CCJ, Council of Christians and Jews and interfaith work, and we've both been involved in that together. I was both disappointed and highly pleased by two sets of reactions. CCJ of Team Christian on that board, only one rang me after October 7 to see if I had any family in Israel, if anybody was affected. Another one rang me some while later about something else, and I told him that, and he said, "Oh, I thought we just all thought you were normal." I don't know what that means. Anyway, but other than that, so many of my non-Jewish Christian and Muslim friends have rung to reach out. Nothing to do with CCJ. So it's almost as if organized interfaith is wasting my time, where the reality is just interaction, normal human beings.
Yes. I don't think a committee has ever solved anything in its life. It's all about fostering those human relationships and human connections, and we've got a responsibility to do that. So I took it upon myself in the last few weeks when there was an anti-Muslim attack, for example, the two women in Melbourne in the shopping centre, to reach out to a contact in the Muslim community to express my condemnation and my sympathy and my empathy with what they're going through. That's the way forward.
So, question here.
Thank you, Rabbi, for the interesting talk. My question, you referred to Christopher Hitchens a few times, one of the few Jews named Christopher. Another quote of his, Islamophobia, a word invented by fascists, used by cowards to manipulate morons. Not my quote. The coupling of antisemitism and Islamophobia, like in this talk, etc., isn't Islamophobia a completely different phenomenon? Like, obviously attacks against Muslims are reprehensible, but Islam or Muslims are not a race. Islamophobia is typically leveled at people that criticize the influence of political Islam, especially in Western societies. Isn't the actual use of that term misleading, whether it's done in conjunction with condemning antisemitism? I find it quite puzzling that those two terms are used together all the time. What are your thoughts?
So I don't believe in sort of Platonic ideals. I don't think there's a perfect definition of anti-Semitism, a perfect definition of Islamophobia. I just see Jews suffering and being the victims of aggression, discrimination, and Muslims also suffering, and we should try and stamp that out. And how we define it and the terms we use are secondary. It's the problem, and the problem deserves our moral attention.
Thank you. We have a question at the back.
Rabbi Will Cummins speaking. I'm a practicing Catholic and fully support Judaism, and I think the Catholic Church in Australia is finally turning around. I must have read hundreds, if not thousands, of articles since October. I've got a deep appreciation of Jewish history now, etc., etc. In my summation, I think it's jealousy of the Jews, if you have a look at what they've achieved over 3,000 years, especially in the last 200 years. I'm getting a bit emotional. The contribution they've made is astonishing. And the last, I'll say on that, I'm a person of faith, believe in the Bible, and God's chosen people, and it's a fact, is the Jewish people. And I'll leave it at that.
Come back at that. Anything to add?
I'll let that stand.
We have a question. We have a question over in the back. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Chris Ashton. This gentleman here talked about the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and I'm not quite sure I'd use that term, but it did pique my interest, I suppose, about, and maybe you could just share your thoughts on what seems to be an enthusiasm within certain parts, at least, of the Jewish community for the restriction of speech and symbols, and especially when a link is very clearly made, perhaps in Parliament and in other places, to anti-Semitism. So, there's a problem with anti-Semitism, and we need to impose speech laws and things like that. I'd be interested in your thoughts in that.
no one's in favour of free speech to an absolute extent, and speech where it incites hatred, which can lead to violence, I think is a valid target for legislation. Symbols which do the same, symbols which create intimidation. There's obviously a very important balance to be made. There are important free speech arguments, but we're not a society which values free speech over, for example, other aspects of people's welfare. And the Parliament here and the state government have drawn a certain line, which I happen to support. But I agree we should remain vigilant, and we shouldn't go too far to restrict free speech. But free speech is not the be-all and end-all.
But let me just ask a question before we wrap up about Australia. And I mean, historically, Australia, particularly since 1945, has been a safe haven for Jews, and many Jews fled here, as we know, from the Holocaust, and made a new life and a successful life here. But now, as one commentator has remarked, Australia has shifted from paradise to something approaching a nightmare for its Jewish citizens. That's a quote from a commentator. How confident are you, given all that's been said and all that we've thought about and discussed tonight, and the work that you've been engaged with over many years now, how confident are you that paradise for Australia's Jewish community can be regained?
I think it can, because I think we have to believe that things can get better. Otherwise, we would lose hope. And as Rabbi Sachs said, the Jews are people who never lose hope. And I think with work, it can be done. I think we've seen even in the last few weeks, I think the police and the authorities have got a grip on what's going on. There was a time, definitely, where that grip was lost. It was a very frightening time because you did not know what you would wake up of a morning to find it happened the night before, where been attacked, where been burned down. In terms of law enforcement, a grip seems to have been restored. And now comes the longer moral, intellectual advocacy work to address wider problems and deeper aspects of the problem.
Good. Thank you. Well, look, on that optimistic note, I am very pleased to be able to invite Julian Siegel, who is the Special Commissioner, to give the vote of thanks. Julian, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very honoured to have been present to hear this and to be able to give the vote of thanks to Rabbi Elton. And thank you, can I acknowledge Tom Switzer, and to you, Peter. Thank you so much for inviting me. I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be in the role that I'm in if I didn't agree completely with Rabbi Elton, particularly in relation to being hopeful, because I don't think I would have taken this role if I had not had at least some hope that we could make a difference to the eruption of antisemitism that really took place after October 7. But I think that we've had such a wonderful exposition of the history of antisemitism and some of its root causes that we all know that it didn't start with October 7. It's been rumbling along for centuries, millennia, in fact, and we've actually been subject to a wonderful learned exposition of such a topic, from religious anti-Semitism way back, with taxes being levied to the Jews, to, as we know, and that was all religious based, to what happened in Nazi Germany with the race focus on Jews, and to where we are now, to Gaza, Israel, and the link between Zionism, which is just a belief, of course, in the existence of a state like Israel, or the state of Israel, and anti-Semitism. And that discussion of the hatred on the left and hatred on the right, powerful controlling the world or the powerless, those tropes. What I think we have, and you didn't use the term, Rabbi, but I do think what we've seen is the left and the right coming together in a circle. Whether that's a horseshoe or a circle, but they're merging, and we are seeing a lot of hate coming from these old tropes, these old myths, and people not even quite so conscious of where they're coming from. But it is the hate that is expressed, and that needs to be stamped out. And I think events like this are just those sorts of occasions where we can discuss it, can hear different views, but can come away from the actual lecture better informed and better understanding. And that is the beginning of how we counter it. It's education. We have to do it through the schools. We have to deal through universities, but we have to deal through groups as this. And I hope you will each take away additional knowledge and understanding and use it in your own circles, because it's the way we need to change the thinking in our community, strengthen the knowledge and change the thinking against Jews, because actually it's all false. Jews are just people. They're neither powerful nor powerless. There are some who are powerful and some who are powerless, just like everyone else. So I hope you've learnt as much. I found it a fascinating exposition of the history, but nevertheless the resilience of Jews and the resilience of anti-Semitism, which is itself very, very concerning and very puzzling. But with education, with good discussion and goodwill, I'm also hopeful that we can stamp it out. But it does need conscious effort and the coming together of people of many faiths as well as of good faiths. So will you join me in thanking Rabbi Elton for a wonderful address?
For decades, the CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel and then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.